Let me read you a verse, and I want you to feel the full weight of it, because most channels won't. When the Lord your God brings you into the land and clears away many nations before you, you shall devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show them no mercy. No mercy. That's the command. Men, women, children, an entire people by name marked for the sword. And it doesn't come from a warlord or a tyrant. It comes, the Bible says, from God himself. Richard Dawkins read that and called the God of the Old Testament the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. A petty, vindictive, ethnic cleansing bully. And honestly, if you've ever read the book of Joshua and felt something turn in your stomach, you're not a bad Christian, you're paying attention. This is the verse skeptics save for last. The one they think ends the conversation. So let's not run from it. Here's what most people miss. This is not a video that explains the problem away. This is not a video that tells you to just have more faith and stop asking. And this is not a video that pretends the verse isn't sitting right there on the page. We're going to read it honestly, all of it. Because here's the strange thing. The same book that gives this command, the same campaign, the same chapters, quietly keeps a Canaanite alive. A woman, a foreigner, from one of those condemned cities. And not just alive. She marries in. She becomes a hero. And 400 years later, her name shows up in a family tree you've heard read out loud at Christmas. The genealogy of Jesus. Hold that thought. We'll get to her. But first, we have to do the hard part. We have to actually look at what the command says, who it was aimed at, and why, before we ever get to whether the word genocide is the right one. And I'll tell you up front, by the end, I don't think it is. But not for the cheap reasons you've probably been handed. Stay with me. This goes deeper than you think. Okay, the command. Let's read it the way the people who first heard it would have. The Hebrew word at the center of all this is harem. You'll see it translated. Devote to complete destruction. And that translation is where a lot of the horror comes from. But harem doesn't simply mean kill everyone. At its root, it means to set something apart, to ban it from ordinary human use, to hand it over entirely to God. When something was placed under harem, you couldn't keep it, you couldn't profit from it, it wasn't yours anymore. It belonged to God, for God to do with as he chose. Sometimes that meant destruction, but the word is about ownership and surrender before it's ever about a body count. Sit with that because we'll come back to it. And I'm not going to soften the next part. The command as written is brutal. Whole cities. Deuteronomy says, save alive nothing that breathes. If you read that and you don't flinch, you're not reading it carefully. I flinch. You should too. Anyone who quotes you these verses with a smile has stopped paying attention to what they say. So that's the weight. Now here's the question nobody asked first. Who were the Canaanites? Because we've been handed a picture of peaceful villagers minding their own business when an army of zealots came over the hill. That's not what the text describes, and it's not what the wider record describes either. The Bible uses a specific word for what was happening in those cities. Toba, abomination. And it lists what it means, not as propaganda, as charges, ritual prostitution baked into the worship, incest codified into the culture. And at the dark center of it, The thing the Old Testament returns to again and again was something close to nausea, child sacrifice. Children passed through the fire to a god called Molech, burned as an act of worship. The land, Leviticus says, vomited out its inhabitants. That's the image. Not a king deciding he wanted real estate. A land so saturated with the blood of its own children that it convulsed. Now, here's where it gets remarkable. If God hated these people because of who they were, their blood, their ethnicity, you'd expect the order to come fast. The moment Israel exists, wipe them out. That's how ethnic hatred works. It doesn't wait. But it waited 400 years. Go back to Genesis. God is talking to Abraham centuries before any of this. And he tells him his descendants will be slaves in a foreign land for 4 generations. And then he gives the reason for the delay. They cannot have the land yet, he says, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Read that again. God is saying, it's not bad enough yet. I will not move against them while there is still time. 4 centuries of patience. 400 years of a door left open. The judgment doesn't come because a people exists. It comes when a civilization has spent 400 years burning its own children, and there is, in the language of the text, nothing left to wait for. And there's one more thing the text is careful to say, and it cuts directly against the racism charge. When God explains to Israel why they're getting this land, he goes out of his way to tell them it is not a reward. Deuteronomy chapter 9. Do not say in your heart, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me in. No, it is because of the wickedness of these nations. And then, this is the part that should stop you. He warns Israel that if they do the same things, the same land will spit them out too. Catch what just happened there. The standard isn't ethnic, it's moral, and it applies to Israel just as much as to anyone else. The Canaanites aren't being punished for being Canaanite. They're being judged for what they did. And the same judge is putting his own chosen people on notice that he'll do the exact same thing to them. That's not how genocide talks. Genocide doesn't warn you that you're next. So we've got the command, and now we've got the context. But context isn't an answer. You might be thinking, fine, they were terrible, but the order still says, kill everyone. And you'd be right to push on that. So now we have to look at what the conquest actually was, and what the words, Mark, destroy them all actually meant to the people who wrote them. Because this is where the whole picture starts to crack open. Quick pause. If you're still here, you're already doing something most people won't. You're sitting with a hard question instead of grabbing the easy answer on either side. If that's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel reach the people wrestling with the same doubt you are. So far we've seen the charge and we've seen the context. Now watch what the text does next. Because this is the part nobody tells you. Here's the thing about ancient war writing. We read these verses with modern eyes like they're a police report. So many killed, here's the count. But that's not how anybody in the ancient Near East wrote about war. Not the Egyptians, not the Hittites, not the Assyrians, not Israel. A scholar named K. Lawson Younger spent years comparing Israel's conquest accounts side by side with the war records of every neighboring empire, and he found the The same thing over and over. Total destruction was a figure of speech, a genre. Kings would carve into stone that they had annihilated an enemy, left no survivor, wiped a nation off the earth, about nations that show up alive and fighting in the very next campaign. You don't have to take his word for it. We have the stones. There's a slab called the Merneptah Stele, carved by an Egyptian pharaoh around 1200 years before Christ. And on it he brags, in stone, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. Israel destroyed, seed gone, wiped out. Except you're reading this, and you know how the story of Israel goes. They weren't destroyed, not even close. The Pharaoh is using the language everyone used, crushing, decisive, total sounding, and everyone who read it knew exactly how to take it. There's another one. The Moabite stone. A king named Mesha, a neighbor of Israel, carved his own victory into rock. And he says he took an Israelite town and devoted every last person in it to his God. Same idea as Harem, same total language, different God. This was just how that whole world talked about winning a war. So when Joshua says he left none remaining and destroyed all that breathed, pay attention to this. He is writing in the exact convention of his own time. Not a body count, a victory formula. And here's how we know for certain it wasn't literal. Turn the page, read the very next book. Judges. It opens, and the Canaanites are everywhere. Whole cities of them. Whole peoples. The Jebusites still holding Jerusalem. The Canaanites still in the valleys with their iron chariots. So many of them that Israel can't drive them out. These are the same people Joshua supposedly utterly destroyed one book earlier. They're alive. They're numerous. They're a problem. Stop and feel how strange that is. If you wanted to invent a genocide story, you wouldn't write a sequel where the victims are still walking around in crowds. The Bible itself, 2 pages later, tells you the total destruction language was never meant literally. The text refutes the literal reading. It's not a contradiction the editors missed. It's the original audience understanding their own genre. We crush them never meant every single human is in the ground. It meant the power of those cities to corrupt Israel was broken. The strongholds fell. The threat ended. And now the part that quietly takes the whole racism charge apart. There's a man in the book of Joshua named Achan, an Israelite, one of the chosen people. After the fall of Jericho, he takes some of the plunder that had been placed under Harem, devoted to God, and hides it in his tent. And what happens to him? The ban falls on him. The same destruction meant for Canaan comes down on a Hebrew, because he treated what belonged to God as if it were his to take. Let that land. The harem was never about ethnicity. It was about holiness, about what belonged to God and what didn't. The moment an Israelite crossed that line, he was under the same judgment as any Canaanite city. There is no racial category here at all. There's only one question the text keeps asking of Canaanite and Hebrew alike. Are you on God's side, or are you devoted to the things he's judging? Which means the whole frame we started with is wrong. This was never a people marked for death because of their blood. It was a corrupt civilization under a judicial sentence, written up in the war language of its day, applied by the same standard to anyone, including Israel, who chose the same path. But I told you about a Canaanite woman, a hero, her name in the family tree of Jesus. It's time I kept that promise. Her name was Rahab. She lived in Jericho, the first city to fall, the one with the trumpets and the walls. She was a Canaanite. By every category we've been talking about, she was exactly the kind of person the command named. And she ran a brothel built into the city wall. When Israel's 2 spies came into the city, she's the one who hid them. She'd heard what their God had done. The sea that split, the kings that fell, and something in her turned. She didn't say, "This is unfair." She said, "Your God is the real one." And she begged for her life and the lives of her family. The spies told her to hang a scarlet cord from her window. And when the city came down, every house was leveled, except the one with the cord. Rahab lived. Her whole family lived. A Canaanite household pulled out of the city under judgment because she turned toward the God who was judging it. And she didn't just survive. Read the genealogy in the first chapter of Matthew, the family line of Jesus, and there she is. Rahab, the Canaanite, the prostitute from the condemned city, great-great-grandmother of King David, an ancestor of the Messiah himself. The book accused of erasing the Canaanites wrote one of them into the bloodline of its own God, and she's not even alone. There's a whole Canaanite city, the Gibeonites, that hears Israel is coming and sues for peace. They trick Joshua into it honestly, but when the deception comes out, Israel honors the treaty anyway. They live. An entire Canaanite population, untouched, protected by Israel's own oath. If the command were kill every Canaanite, no exceptions, none of this is possible. Rahab is impossible. The Gibeonites are impossible. But there they are, written right into the story. So here's the bridge I want you to walk across with me. Think about how we still talk. A team wins big, and we say they destroyed them, annihilated them, wiped the floor. Nobody calls an ambulance. We all know what total language means in the mouth of a victor. It means decisive. It means over. It doesn't mean a morgue. Every culture that's ever fought a war has talked this way. Ancient Israel was no different. And think about the other word, judgment. We have a whole institution built on the difference between a man who kills and a judge who sentences. Same outcome sometimes. A life ended. But we don't call them the same thing because one is hatred and the other is justice, handed down after the case is heard. 400 years of evidence. A charge sheet of burned children. A verdict delayed until there was nothing left to wait for. That is not the profile of a murderer. That is the profile of a court. So let me say it plainly. This is not the story of a people destroyed for their blood. This is not the story of a God who hated a race. And this is not the story the word genocide was built to describe. Genocide targets people for who they are. This text judged a civilization for what it did, warned its own chosen nation it would face the same sentence, wrote the total victory language every nation of its day used, and then, in the middle of the so-called extermination, reached into the condemned city and pulled out a prostitute and her family and set her in the family tree of the Savior of the world. That's not erasure. That's mercy, woven straight through judgment. Now, does that answer every ache you feel when you read those verses? I don't think it does. And I don't want to insult you by pretending it does, but it does mean the easy charge, the Dawkins charge, the one that's supposed to end the conversation, was never reading the text honestly in the first place. So let me leave you with 3 things to carry out of this. First, genocide is the wrong word, and not because we're playing word games. It's wrong because the thing it describes, people marked for death over their blood, with no charge and no escape, is the opposite of what the text actually does. What we found instead was a judicial sentence based on conduct, delayed 400 years, written in the war language of its time, applied to Israelites and Canaanites by the very same standard, and full of exits for anyone who turned. That's not genocide. That's something far stranger and far more careful. Second, you were never required to pretend the hard verses are easy. Faith that can't look straight at Joshua isn't strong faith. It's faith that hasn't been tested yet. The God of the Bible is not afraid of your hardest question. So stop being afraid of it too. And third, the one I want you to actually feel. The book that the whole world points to and says, look, erasure, look, hatred. That book kept a Canaanite woman from a condemned city, gave her a scarlet cord and a future, and wrote her name into the family line of God Himself. If the story were really about wiping a people out, Rahab is the one detail you delete. Instead, she's the one they immortalized. That tells you everything about the kind of God standing behind these pages. So let me ask you, which part of this hit you hardest? The 400 years of waiting, the war language, or Rahab's name in that family tree? Tell me down in the comments. I read them. And if this gave you something solid to stand on, send it to the one person you know who's wrestling with exactly this verse. It might be the thing that keeps them in the room,